Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start the presentation slowly so people can join. So I'm going to present myself. So my name is Andréane Fortin. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator, and I work at the IRCM clinic. So IRCM clinic is a clinic affiliated with the CHUM, a Montreal hospital in Montreal, Quebec. And I work with it's one of the biggest clinic of type 1 patients in Montreal and in Quebec. And we follow around 700 patients with type 1 diabetes. And I work with two endocrinologists, Rémi Rabassa-Lorette, that you may have heard of, and Dr. Nadine Taleb. So today the talk will be how to optimize carbohydrate counting with the use and advances in new technologies that are coming up quickly. So I encourage you throughout the presentation to put your questions in the Q&A on top of your Zoom. I'm going to try to answer them during the presentation, or I'm going to allow a certain period at the end of my presentation that's going to last around 45 minutes. The recording is also going to be possible at the end if you've missed some things, and a lot of the tools that I'm going to show you are on the Type 1 website. So just to start off with what I'm going to discuss today, first of all, we're going to see why counting carbohydrates, because it's such a challenge, and how to use the technologies that are available right now to optimize and help you in that carb counting. So why is it important to do carbohydrate counting? As you may know, carbs or carbohydrates are the main food group that has an impact on your blood sugar. So counting carbs allows a flexibility in the amount of carbohydrate that you can eat or that you eat throughout the day and your meal portion, rather than having fixed dose of insulin at every meal. There are studies that show that it also improves glycemic control and hemoglobin A1C. And studies show that it improves quality of life because of that flexibility in meal portioning and carbohydrate intake. And some studies also show that it can reduce insulin requirements because it increases the precision in your control. However, the list of disadvantages is a bit longer. It's an additional burden. I don't live with diabetes, but following a lot of patients, I can understand the challenges it is to constantly have to count carbs at every meal. So some patients tend to limit their variability and tend to eat more packaged products that have a nutrition value table, so it's easier to calculate. There's also a source of error possible, which lead to a source of error in the doses of insulin, which leads to a greater variability in your blood sugar control. It's also something to be conscious, but counting carbs leads to a focus in terms of carbohydrates on food. So patients that are on the edge or at risk of eating disorder, it's an additional burden. So like I said, it's an additional challenge. A study done at our clinic here, which was 10 years ago, but the results are probably the same if we did it this year. They asked 50 patients with type 1 diabetes to estimate the amount of carbs, and they found a margin of error of 20%. And most of the meals were underestimated. So patients told that the amount of carbs in the meal was lower than it actually was. And the greater the meal, the greater the error was. For sure, if I want to calculate, and if my meal has 100 grams of carbohydrate, is it actually 100 grams or it's 120 or 80 grams rather than a meal with 15 or 20 grams? The margin of error is usually smaller. And it was at the breakfast that the mistakes were lower, because at breakfast there's often more the availability of a package, like for example breakfast cereals or bread. So carbohydrate counting, it's difficult, but we want to keep, as a dietitian, I always want to keep the notion of pleasure. And that's why, that's how the new technology can help you to limit the task of carbohydrate counting and to have pleasure eating rather than being stressed. Carbohydrate counting is a challenge, but it's challenge over a lot of other challenges that you face daily. In purple, that are the purple circles are the things that are related to carbohydrate counting. But as you see, there's circles of other colors of other factors that affect your blood sugar or your control. That's not related to the amount of carbs. For example, if I'm the menstrual cycle, stress, physical activities, time of day, the season. So if a lot of patients told me I eat the same thing, give myself the same amount, but one day it works, the other day it doesn't. That's because there's so many other factors. And there's a list that's really common that I always show my patients. It's a list of 42 factors that affect blood sugar. And the Better Registry also have a table similar to that. But just to show as the more you have diabetes, the more time you live with diabetes, the more factors you see or that affects your blood sugar. And if we all together had a round table, we would maybe find other factors that's not on those lists. So it's really to understand that carbs has an impact on blood sugar, but other things can have an impact also. Here, I told a lot about carbohydrate counting. Carbohydrate counting means counting carbs because carbs is the nutrient that has the greater impact on blood sugar. However, there's other nutrients that we need to take into consideration because they impact also. As a dietitian, I often recommend to follow a balanced meal, healthy plate methods like Canada's Food Guide. So having protein, starch, and vegetables. Because when we eat that type of meal, which is balanced, the balance of nutrient looks like mimics more or is more juxtaposed to the action of your insulin that you see here in green. So there's a better glycemic control while eating that type of meal. However, if we eat simple sugar, so simple sugar meaning fast-acting sugar, the type of sugar we recommend when we're in hypoglycemia, example, juice, honey, jam. Simple sugar, the glycemia tends to rise fast and to a higher value. And if we look at the action of insulin in green, if we take your meal and at the same time your insulin, the fast sugar rise your blood sugar faster than the action of insulin. So that means that you're at higher risk of hyperglycemia right after, but afterwards, once the simple sugar, which rises fast and goes down, when your insulin is active in your body, your sugar of your carbohydrates are no longer active, so you're more at risk of hypoglycemia afterwards. Okay, so what to do in that situation? If we want to juxtapose the two curves, we could try to do our injection of insulin closer or before the meal, so the two curves are juxtaposed, and also using the technologies, which I'm going to tell you how to use it afterwards. Then we have fats and protein. So we often talk about the pizza meal. So pizza is a common meal that's higher in fat and that contains protein. So fat and protein makes it slower to digest, meaning the blood sugar rises quite high, but more steadily and later on. So if we take our insulin at the same time at that meal, our insulin is active right away or 5 to 15 minutes afterwards, but our blood sugar hasn't had the time to go up as fast as the action of insulin. So we're more at risk of hypoglycemia in the beginning, but afterwards, once our insulin is no longer active or really less active, that's when our blood sugar is high from our pizza meal. So what to do in that sense, I'm going to give you strategy afterwards. Some studies show that protein, if taken alone, increases your blood sugar from 1 hour and a half afterwards. Without eating carbohydrates, it could be equivalent to eating 20 grams of carbohydrate. However, those studies have shown that we need to consume a large amount of protein to have that effect, meaning around 75 grams of protein. 75 grams of protein is equivalent to a steak of 225 grams. We usually recommend 75 to 100 grams of protein per meal. So it's quite a large amount, but it's an amount that a lot of people eat, not a lot, but some people are capable of eating. When we eat a smaller amount of carbs, but with protein, a large amount of protein, we may need some additional insulin to cover, because it's like if a proportion of the proteins are converted to glucose, to carbohydrates, sorry. Fat, a bit the same effect. It raises the blood sugar, but it puts it high, stays high for a longer period of time, and the effect could be up to 5 hours after eating. Delay the carbohydrate absorption and delaying the glucose rise. Fat quickly has approximately the same effect as protein, but both of them have an additional effect, additive effect. I'm just going to show you some studies that tried different things. So this study wanted to know if the type of fat has a different effect. So eating mono, poly, or saturated fat has a different effect on blood sugar. And as you see on top, all of the curves are juxtaposed. So if we have carbohydrate they tested avocado, margarine, or butter, it has the same effect on your blood sugar. Then they tested the amount of fat, and they showed that the more fat you have, the more insulin you need over a long term. And the more fat you have, the more insulin you need straightforward in addition to your amount. So here they show that for 60 grams of fat, 60 grams of fat is quite a large amount of fat. It's equivalent of around 5 tablespoons of butter, so 5 cubes of butter. The better control is with 50% of your insulin straightforward and 50% over an hour and 45. And you may need around 20% more insulin in the beginning of that meal. So what to do, I'm going to show you the strategy afterwards, but just a couple more studies here. They tested a pancake recipe. So the main the standard recipe was low in fat and low in protein. And you see if they do the bolus, that it tends to bring down the blood sugar so the risk of hypoglycemia is present. However, if the recipe, they added more protein or more fat, it stabilized the blood sugar. But if protein were added, it's a negative effect. So the blood sugar stays high and remain high. Another Swedish study here that tried 4 meals, same carbohydrate intake, but different macronutrients breakdown. And they showed that the better control was with the meal that was high in protein and moderate in carbohydrate. So the meal was 43 grams of carbohydrate and around 50 grams of protein, and that was the type of meal. So avocado, shrimps, mashed potatoes, roast beef, and some vegetables. So it's depicted by the orange line here that you see it's more stable with that type of meal. However, this study was done only 4 hours after the meal, and as I told you, could be up to 5 hours afterwards. So we don't know what the tendency is afterwards. And it was before the arrival of the CGMs. So what are the strategies? It's a lot of trials and errors, and that's why the new technologies that are present are going to help you. But for people on insulin pumps, it could be to increase the dosage by 25 to 35%, and or use the advanced features of your pump. And on multiple daily injection, approximately the same. But since you don't have a pump of insulin, you need to mimic the action or the feature of the pump by dividing the dose into injections. For example, doing a proportion of the dose in the beginning, maybe that that dose at the beginning a bit bigger, and the other injections 2 hours afterwards, for example. What are the pump features? We call them square bolus, extended bolus, or dual bolus. There are different names based depending on the type of pump you have. For example, square bolus is that the entire bolus of insulin is delivered over a period of time. That's the image you see here. So for example, if I was to give 10 units, I can say that my 10 units, I want it over 2 hours. The extended bolus is different. It means that I can choose to have a proportion of my units of insulin straight forward, and the balance on over a period of time, for example, 2 hours. So I can say I want 5 units or 50%. So 5 units right now, and the other 50% spread over 2 hours. On the new pumps of insulin right now, and on the closed loop system, some of the features are not really present. For example, on the tandem control IQ, you can have an extended bolus, but only for 2 hours. And on the new Medtronic, it's not possible anymore. But on the opposite side, these new pumps are made to do that adjustments on their own by adjusting the insulin needs. Here it was shown that an insulin pump strategy. So for a bolus, the same bolus has 10 units. Like I said, maybe having a bit more at the beginning and the other spread out. So here they did 30% more, so 13 units, and 50% right now, and 50% or approximately 50% spread over 2 hours, which was a better control. Like I said, here is an example. It's an example that seemed to be a good starting point, but starting point, it's a lot of trials and error. If you're on injections, here they tried that fat meal. They just added 30% of the dose. And as you see in green, just adding 30% without making adjustment increases the risk of hypoglycemia. However, the better control was when 100% of the dose was done, and an additional 30% was done 3 hours afterwards. Feel free to ask questions if I go too fast or if there's something that's not clear. But bolus timing is something I repeat constantly, because like I said, what we want is really to juxtapose the action of insulin to the tendency in our blood sugar. So the higher the meal is high in simple sugar, that rises the blood sugar fast. We want our injection to be even further from when we eat. So for simple sugar or meals high in glycemic index, maybe 15 to 45 minutes. The more balanced the meal is, the more we can go closer to the eating closer to injection, but 5 to 15 minutes is still something I recommend. And when our meal is higher in fat and or in protein, that's when we want maybe the advanced features or having an additional bolus afterwards. The importance of that feature or the importance of the injection is even bigger at breakfast, because what we see is at breakfast are in the morning, many patients, almost all patients are more resistant to insulin because we have the down phenomenon or the surge of hormones that arrive at 3 to 4 a.m. that makes our body more resistant. So we need more insulin to cover that higher resistance. Not more insulin, but maybe injecting yourself even before. So that's if there's a meal I would like you to focus on injection before is really breakfast. That's going to make the biggest difference. And it's also a meal that may be a bit easier to do the injections before, because it's often a meal more of a routine. So I would say, for example, my patients, just making your injection or your bolus and then preparing breakfast, putting your toast in the toaster, spreading it with peanut butter, or making your breakfast bowl, your cereal bowl and your coffee. You have 5 minutes, and then bring it in your routine even before. Here's just an image to show that the curve in red is making injection 20 minutes before that were older type of insulin, but as you see, compared to having at the beginning of the meal or after the meal. So would it be is it another option just to change rather than injection before, just changing the order of what we eat? So here are studies done in type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, but I think the image and the message is the same. So you see in green here on your left that eating your vegetables before your carbohydrate, the rise in blood sugar is lower. And here, the line in purple is eating protein before the carbohydrate. So you see, changing the order meal also helps, but I think it goes in the same way as if we eat our vegetables before our carbohydrate. Once we eat our carbohydrate, that's when our insulin is active. So it's approximately the same as making our injections 5 to 15 minutes before. Glycemic index is another thing. So why counting carbohydrate? Other nutrients, but that's the type of carbohydrate. It's not there's tables available. It's not something I teach routinely, but just my main focus is really to see that because it's difficult to put it in practice, and it's another thing that you need to take into consideration. But the higher in fruit and fiber your meal is, the less refined and the lower it is in added sugar, the lower is the glycemic index. So what do we do now when we're eating out or going at restaurants or with friends? There's a webinar I encourage you to listen to that was done by Maud Fontaine, a dietitian, and that really explains all the tools that's available for you. So do we have any questions about carbohydrate counting before going to the main of the presentation? So the goal is to see, I told you that really difficult. There's a lot of things to put into consideration, but how can the new technology, or how can we simplify it in our routine? And that's how new technologies could help you. So there's a lot of, there's more and more applications that are available right now to help you. Here is the tool about in the Better Registry with all the pros and cons of all the applications that are available right now. I would say that, like I said, there's some that are visual. So you see the image of a plate, and you can change the proportion of carbs in your plate to see the amount of carb that changes. There's some that are database from Europe, from the States, which are not sometimes on the same food that we eat here. So the main one would be Nutrients Canada, the one here on top, because it's from our Canadian database of food. I have a question especially on that. So do you have food that are good in estimating carbs in a meal based on a photo? We have one also. I don't know if it's in the table. There's one called quinoa, KEENOA, which uses artificial intelligence to take the image of a food to estimate the amount of carbs, which is based on the Canadian food database, sorry. But in my knowledge, you need to be affiliated with a dietitian or invited by a dietitian to have access to that application. Okay, so now another technology is CGMs, continuous glucose monitoring. Here at my clinic, almost all my patients have it. I know it's not maybe representative, but it's being more and more common here in Quebec, even more because it's covered. The new systems are now covering mostly Dexcom and Freestyle by the RAMQ. I know it changes province by provinces also, but these tools really help us to be more proactive and to see the trends in blood sugar while using the arrows. So to see the tendency, how our blood sugar is anticipated to change, and to see us and using the alarms to help us be more proactive. These are two things that when we take blood sugar measured, we don't have access to that information. So how to use those information? Here you see the document that was done by Better, just to see the tendency here. It's based on the arrows of different system, does the arrow mean? And so what's the predicted value in the next 10 minutes based on the trends arrow, sorry. So if we look at arrows, how to use them, it's really when I eat and I see an arrow, for example, going up, maybe I'm going to add a correction factor that's higher than what was calculated by my medical team or in my pump to consider the fact that I'm eating, I'm high, and I'm going to be high, even more higher. If on the opposite, my arrow is going down, sorry. So I'm eating and I'm going down, maybe delaying a bit the bolus time so you don't, so you limit the risk of hypoglycemia. Using alarms. So these tools also have the possibility to ring or vibrate. Really a good tool. We don't want it to be overwhelming. So it's really choosing. My first thing is really to limit the alarms at the beginning and then add or making it more serré once you're familiar with it. So for alarms, the first one I recommend is the hypoglycemia alarm, but I suggested at a value that's higher than hypoglycemia to prevent hypoglycemia rather than always correcting the hypoglycemia. So I usually say to put at 4.2 or 4.5. The other alarm I suggest is a high blood sugar alarm. But the value of the high blood sugar alarm is really an alarm that you would make an action to correct. For example, if you put an alarm at 8, if you're at 8 after a meal or throughout the day, would you make a correction? More often than not, no. So it's just going to be annoying for you. But rather if you say, personally, I only correct when I'm above 15. You can put an alarm at 15, and then once it rings, now you can correct based on your correction factor or the tools that you chose with your medical team. And it's also possible with those alarms, maybe to see, oh, I made an error in my carb counting, and I'm high after the meal. Oh, I may correct it. Or my meal was high in fat and or in protein. I may do that additional dose, like I said, the split dosing. I may do the additional 50% of my dose once my alarm rings after a meal to see is it an hour after, 2 hours, or 3 hours after, because it really depends on the amount the amount of fat and or protein. Some systems also have the possibility to have an alarm of how the speed it rises or it lowers, but I usually don't suggest those types of alarms at the beginning. I think I talked about that, but there's also tables and studies that have different mathematical values or tools to calculate the amount of correction doses needed based on your correction factor, your blood sugar, but also the arrows. It's a lot of precision, and it's not something I usually teach my patient. Something that I could, if my patient really wants a lot of precision, something we can discuss, but it's still something that adds to the burden of diabetes and adds to the complexity. And there's so many other factors that go into consideration, like, for example, if I was stressed, physical activity, the composition of a meal. So it's not something I would suggest at the beginning, but just having a low blood sugar alarm, a high blood sugar that's at the value that you would correct, I think this is a good beginning. Now, insulin pumps. I know not all of you are on insulin pumps here. I know it's not available and there's a cost that comes with it, but that's a technology that was present for many years, but the new algorithms or the new pumps are constantly being better at predicting and adjusting your blood sugar control. And we're going towards more semi-automatic pumps. Right now in Quebec, there's two. There's the Medtronic 780G and the Tandem Control IQ. And Omnipod is coming up in the next year with their version. So semi-automatic pump means that with a CGM, the two of them and your pump the two of them talk together to adjust your insulin based on your blood sugar tendency. So if they see that the blood sugar rises, they're going to increase your basal or your insulin. And the opposite, if they see that your blood sugar tends to go lower, they're going to decrease the insulin administration. So this is a good tool to prevent fluctuation in glycemia. And it's also something interesting to rectify any errors, big errors in carbohydrate counting. So for example, the same example as the beginning, if I estimate 100 grams, if precisely was 120 grams, the pump is able to add a bit more insulin by correction factor or by basal administration to correct that error that led you to hyperglycemia. However, these pumps, is really important to continue to do the bolus before the meal, because when we eat, our carbs raises our blood sugars. But if we do our injection if we do our bolus of insulin during the meal or after the meal, the blood sugar already started to go up. So the basal of the pump gave you more insulin. But once you tell him that you ate, now it's going to give you an additional bolus of insulin. So the two of them, the two insulin administration increases the risk of hypoglycemia. Here I'm just going to look on the opposite in hypoglycemia. So once you're going low or closer to the hypoglycemia, the pump already started to decrease your basal or decrease the insulin administration because it saw that you were going to go low. So if you often need less carbohydrate than when you were under pump or injection, because if you ate the same amount, 15 or even more carbohydrates, you're at risk of going in hyperglycemia afterwards. These pumps, some of them still have the bolus, the extended bolus option, but it's less and less necessary because the pumps are able to adjust the effect of the effect of protein and fat by increasing or adjusting the insulin afterwards. The two newer pumps also have other features. For Medtronics, we're at the 780G here in Quebec. So the 780G also have an option right now. It's called meal recognition. So this feature is that if a meal was if you missed to do a bolus of insulin, the pump is able to see that the rise in blood sugar looks like a meal that's forgotten because it rises quickly. So it's able to do correction of insulin to limit that hyperglycemia. And the same thing if there was an error in carb counting, and can increase the correction afterwards to limit the impact. However, it's not, I didn't test it or I don't have an answer to know that, for example, if I didn't bolus for 100-gram meal, I don't think the pump is going to be able to correct that without problems. So there's a certain limit in the amount of insulin a pump can give, a security limit. In the Tandem Control IQ, it's not a feature that's sold that way, but the pump, if you have an error in carb counting or a small carbs that you didn't enter, the pump is able to administer more and more basal to counteract that error, and same thing to do correction bolus. So these pumps are able to alleviate a bit the task of carb counting, or to limit the size of the impact of carb counting error. So what's the future right now? So there's a study here done that was done with 30 patients with type 1 diabetes over 3 weeks. So patients were asked to carb count precisely, or to estimate the amount by 4 groups. So if it was a low carb meal, medium, high, or very high carb meals, and the results showed that the time and range between estimating or precisely counting carbs was similar. So a bit more by counting carbs, but it wasn't significant. And when it was done by the simplified method, so classifying your carbs by groups, the basal insulin delivery was a bit higher for sure. But it's just to show that maybe estimating portion or estimating meal size is something that's going to come up in the future. And there's even a pump in the States, in Boston, the Beta Bionic, that you only need to enter your weight in the pump, and the algorithm is able to adjust the ratio, the correction factor, and the basal automatically. And you only need to say if it's your usual meal. So usual based on yourself, on the amount of carbs you usually eat. Is it lower or bigger than usual? And it's able to adjust. We're not here in Canada and Quebec right now, but just to see the future. But even with those pumps, usual, small, big, for carb classification, you still need to know what's a carbohydrate and what's the amount. You need to know what's 30 grams of carb is and 100 grams is. So I don't think I'm not, it's not the end of carb counting and carb teaching, but it's we're going into simplified carb counting. We're going to technologies that helps to alleviate the task, like applications. We're going to technology that helps to have an impact on the effect of proteins and fat, for example, on blood sugar. So to conclude, I encourage you to ask questions, but really carb counting, like I said, is essential, still present, still needed, but complex. Fats and proteins are other nutrients other than carbs that have a large impact. Bolus timing or timing of insulin injections or bolus is often more important than considering before adjusting insulin doses. Technologies are available. It's constantly changing, evolving on the good side. And these technologies like CGMs, new pumps are the main goal is to be more proactive and also reduce the burden of diabetes management. Because the 42 factors that I showed you, the goal of those tools is that those factors have a less of an impact because it's automatically adjusted by your pump, for example, or by your technology. So thank you for, I hope that you learned some things today. Feel free to go to better to see the tools. The other webinar is going to be October 19 on hormones. And there's also articles of blogs constantly. So keep up to date on the Better Registry. And I have 5-10 minutes for questions. So feel free to ask me questions. I'm here for you today. So just like questions we had before. In the French version, there was questions about, for example, breakfast cereals that a person is not able to control breakfast cereal because the blood sugar rises fast and it's uncontrollable. It's something I often hear a lot. But like I said, breakfast is a meal that needs to be, the injection or the bolus needs to be even before the meal. So sometimes 30 minutes before. Breakfast cereal, another issue with that meal, it's high in fast sugar. And having a more balanced breakfast or balanced meals with protein and a bit of fat, but adding protein to that breakfast cereals, like adding milk for sure, but adding nuts to the cereal and doing the ejection 30 minutes before, it's something that often works well. Because what we want is really have a pleasure of eating and not restricting ourselves in the type of food we eat, just to try different strategies to eat like we were eating before, but not having a larger impact. There are other questions. Do some people have other strategies or other things that they want to share, other applications that they use? I know if some people are not from Quebec that their healthcare team uses. Okay, I have a question. Regarding complex carbs, I've told that yogurt is a good one. I like fig bars. Are they complex? Yogurt is there's not a lot. There's carbs from sugar that you put. There's not a lot of fiber, and it's really low in if in fiber. So having yogurt with, like, for example, a grain, a granola, oats would be more of a complex carbs. Fig bars, excellent. Figs have a lot of fiber, but you may see that it rises your blood sugar a bit fast because it's dried fruits. So there's a fruit with the fiber, but not a lot of water. So it may rise depending on the bar, the granola bar. If there's a lot of fiber in the flour or the crust, it could be helpful. Okay. So I'm gonna wait 1 or 2 minutes, but if there's no questions, I'm gonna end for today and leave you on that and to hope in where you are there's a good temperature and have a good afternoon. So I think I'm gonna close on that. Thank you all for attending and hope it was helpful. Oh, I have last questions if you're still here, just so new info on the Freestyle Lib 3 and Dexcom G7 in Canada. So both of them are going to come up in the fall or beginning of next year, right? So look forward to that. But the Freestyle Lib 2 just launched a new version that it's real time. But if you follow Type 1 Better, they're really up to date on the new technologies. Okay, so thank you and have a good afternoon.